my name is Siobhan, as Dr. Lowett mentioned, and my research looks at the lives of monkeys in Costa Rican sanctuaries. And I'll be starting this presentation with a look at wildlife tourism more generally, and then using Costa Rica as a case study for wildlife tourism. And a little bit about me. So I have a very interdisciplinary background. My undergrad degree was in arts and sciences, so you chose like a degree in a science and an arts or social science. Mine were zoology and English. And then I did an English literature master's, but I focused on science fiction. So I've kind of always had like a toe in science. And then I came to Queen's University for my supervisor, who's no longer here, but she runs the Lives of Animals Research Group, and that's now at York University. And I'm a postdoctoral visitor there, so I'm basically continuing my work this year from my PhD because COVID interrupted my ability to go back and do more field work. And my research areas are in animal welfare, conservation, and tourism. So today's questions, we'll be talking about why most wildlife tourism is harmful towards animals, what good wildlife tourism looks like, and how we can improve the lives of animals in tourism. So the trouble with wildlife tourism, I tried to give like a visual kind of spectrum of, say, like the least ethical to most ethical. But as you can imagine, there's all these local regulations with different countries and different ethics and statuses of animals, either as property or protected, etc. Now, wildlife tourism is generally a niche of nature-based tourism, and it revolves around encounters with wild animals in or near a protected area. And tourism is the leading market-based contributor to funding protected areas, so obviously there's an economic incentive there. And wildlife tourism is very difficult to sort of estimate on a global scale, but it's about 20 to 40% of tourism. Because it is sort of fluid, are you going to see wildlife as the purpose of your tour? Are you seeing them because you're on touring around? So it's hard to kind of calculate. And this is a list of the protected areas as designated by the IUCN. So again, very diverse niche of the economy. And yeah, all different types of interactions represented. So we can generally place wildlife tourism on a spectrum from consumptive to non-consumptive. But I'd like to sort of trouble this idea that wildlife tourism could ever be non-consumptive, truly, because when humans are in an environment or in proximity to wildlife, we're always having an impact. We're not extracted from the wild as much as maybe our history has tried to make us feel as urbanites, for example. So just think about this idea of wildlife watching and ecotourism as maybe not being as non-consumptive as it could be. So for example, here's an article about gorilla trekking ecotourism in Uganda, and they call ecotourism the modern predator, ? So while there's obvious examples of consumptive tourism, consumptive use of wildlife in tourism. This is generally reducing the supply of the target species, and the less obvious examples would be holding, hugging, taking selfies with wild animals, sourcing animals for captivity in zoos from the wild, breeding in zoos without releasing to the wild, and photographic safaris. So while revenue from wildlife tourism can support conservation of endangered species and benefit local communities, much of the industry is self-regulated and enmeshed in the wildlife trade. So as we've discussed, wildlife tourism does endanger more often than it enhances the lives of animals. So increasing research shows that the majority of animals in tourism are suffering from impacts to their welfare or conservation. And what's difficult as a researcher looking at such a complex issue is that generally animal welfare is the field of veterinary, domestic, and agricultural animals, domesticated otherwise. And conservation is the field of conservation biologists. And typically conservation looks at animals as a feature of wildlife. For example, even like sustainability reports, you might just have biodiversity or biological integrity, and that's meant to encompass the lives of what could be millions of animals. So on an individual level, it's really, the kind of the trolley problem, individual versus the population. And so animal welfare and conservation are ultimately two sides of the same coin, and we need to have more research at this sort of nexus, as I call it, where we're looking at how on an individual level we are threatening their species as well, but animals have a right to agency, and we'll go through sort of what a good life would look like for an animal, and believing that they have a right to that is really key to my research. So here's sort of a summary of the different things that can happen when you have wildlife tourism interactions with animals. I don't know, did anyone see Tiger King? That's like a few people. I spoke to Nat Geo about Tiger King because they had a researcher and I published on wildlife selfies. And they were asking me about it. There's a really interesting kind of overlap of this sort of like cultishness of keeping animals and keeping these menageries. And as we'll talk about, this sort of like colonial characteristic of trying to preserve the wild in Florida or Alabama. There's more tigers in, I think, Ontario than in the wild, or something like that. There's lots of animal activity here. And the sort of overlapping factor is that when animals are habituated to humans and to provisioning, meaning being fed or getting resources, it makes them more vulnerable to poaching in the wild because they're not afraid of humans, they'll come up to you, or to zoonotic disease transfer. And zoonotic disease is disease passed between humans and animals. So, for example, COVID-19. So this was a huge factor during the break in international tourism. So in Thailand, for example, I don't know if anyone's been or is from Southeast Asia. In places like Thailand and Bali, there's like the temple monkeys, and these monkeys that some actually species of the macaques have shown they're evolving this bartering skill and trait, right? Because they're getting the higher quality food, they're getting to reproduce with females. So these monkeys are sort of like evolving that bartering skill, and then when international tourism halted, there was like no restaurants open, there was no scrap food around or tourists. And so this like brawl of hundreds of monkeys happened over like a single yogurt cup or something like that. You can find them on YouTube. They're like honestly kind of disturbing. So wildlife tourism's colonial legacy is evident when we look back and see that the earliest zoos were anthropocentric menageries that had both humans and animals collected to represent dominion over nature. And the first zoos in urban areas were like a sort of like mirror to say, look at the wild and how civilized and urban this is. So it has a very colonial characteristic, which I recommend these papers, which look at that. And we'll move forward. So wildlife tourism facilitates poaching and trafficking. So all these sort of factors are intertwined. And because of the lack of global regulations in tourism worldwide, there's this intertwining illegal and legal trade of animal trafficking that intersects with tourism. So for example, this tiger temple in Thailand was shut down eventually, but it was supposed to have been run by Buddhist monks. So Buddhists generally don't kill or harm animals. So, I mean, not necessarily Buddhist by ethic, but they had called themselves Buddhists. So it was kind of like this ethical washing of the tourism attraction that was hiding this trafficking trade in like baby tigers that were found in the basement. And just that the tigers for the pictures are sedated. It was horrible, horrible. The illegal wildlife trade is the fourth biggest illegal crime like in the world in terms of market, and it intersects with drugs, arms trade, and human trafficking. So this is also intersecting then with tourism, and it's part of why it's so difficult to research. And this is related to, because animals are, through the trade, become exotic pets. And this is promoted through the proliferation of wildlife selfies on social media, because this influences our perceptions of what an animal's wild needs are and their behaviors, and it drives the desire for animals. Like, I remember when Harry Potter came out, well, I did research on this, and it showed that when Harry Potter came out, everyone wanted a snowy owl. And like snowy owl like purchasing and breeding went up massively. So it really, our media really drives demand. And having mentioned Tiger King, Doc Antle, who's almost like more nefarious and is featured in Tiger King as well, he's in jail right now for wildlife trafficking. But this is his son, Cody Antle. He's got like 30 million followers, and these are all the animals. So his father is in jail for this, but he is still there promoting on TikTok. And no matter how many times you report them for animal abuse, they don't get taken down, by the way. So, as I've learned, I'm not bitter. Personal vendetta. So wildlife tourism also doesn't guarantee benefits to the host community. Some examples of this, my supervisor works in Botswana, which is really an epicenter of ecotourism. But in other places, there's also issues in Botswana, but wildlife tourism and conservation can be used as reasons to evict indigenous people from their land or restrict their use to the land or to animals there. And so in the example of Botswana, they banned trophy hunting. And so they started integrating photographic safaris. But those photographic safaris aren't going to all the communities that used to get trophy hunting tourism. And those communities sort of got abandoned or felt abandoned when researchers went around to these communities and asked. So you can't just sort of take away a part of that industry, even in trying to make it more ethical or green, and then folks can feel abandoned that are on the wayside that used to have income or support from that tourism. So it's very complicated, and all by the factor that there's no global regulations. So basically any place could say it's sustainable or ecotourism, and it could apply for accreditation to say it is, but there's not going to be any enforcement to check up on it. So this is this phenomenon of greenwashing. And so to engage with local level practices is really key here if we want to improve the lives of animals. Because our approach to, let's say, improving wildlife tourism with elephants in Thailand, where every elephant is owned property of someone or of a tribe, is going to look very different from in Costa Rica, where animals are a public asset and are public property. And most shockingly, most tourists can't tell if an attraction endangers animals. And I could kind of guess this initially, but I was shocked by how serious it is. So these researchers in 2015 looked at 24 types of wildlife tourism around the world. It didn't include zoos or hunting. It just looked at like tiger rides and dolphin petting and everything under the sun there. And they found that there was over 500,000 animals in these attractions. 3 out of 4 of them involved animal abuse or some conservation issue, like taking sloths from the jungle. It dies in a week, get another one, that kind of use. And yet 80% of tourists left positive reviews, and that's over 50,000 reviews. So these places were like abysmal, and tourists were like, great, awesome. And so improving the animal welfare literacy of tourists and tour operators is really critical to reduce the demand for these sorts of opportunities. Unfortunately, without the global regulations and with these issues of countries having different ethics and laws, we need to really start with, or really enforce the idea of literacy amongst tourists. So ultimately, this idea of tourism as a tool for conservation is contentious, and its impact on the community and animals are very context dependent. And while you can improve conservation interest and tourism interest with this buy-in from communities that bear the cost of living near wildlife, ultimately there are trade-offs and that have to be made between the revenue that can be generated and the types of encounter people are willing to pay for, and its ultimate disturbance on wildlife in the community. So generally, wildlife tourism depends on animals, but doesn't really pay them any serious mind on an individual level, and their lives tend to be overlooked and under-examined. So my research is trying to make their lives more visible. Which brings me to Costa Rica, which is in between Panama and Nicaragua in Central America, and is a wonderful, wonderful place. So in Costa Rica, it is illegal to touch wildlife, feed wildlife, capture them for private use. They're a public asset. They are protected by the animal welfare law, by the wildlife conservation law, and Costa Rica has this hashtag Stop Animal Selfies campaign that's like throughout the whole country. So animals are very protected there in theory, and it's one of the top ecotourism destinations in the world. But here's a video I took. For example, this is a restaurant, and can you see like the little tiny capuchin? He's drinking out of this little plate of, I don't know, like milk or sugar or something. And the waiter's like, get out of here. But the plate isn't removed. I would assume this is baiting the monkey. Apparently these monkeys about 50 of them, these capuchins, have been coming to this restaurant for the last 10 years. Every day at 5 p.m. It's like the dinner rush, they come down. Now there's a tourism interest around this, and you can see it on the TripAdvisor reviews. And I kind of like went there as an investigative journalist, and it's close to one of my partner sanctuaries, so it's kind of like this funnel where monkeys get sick, they get diabetes, or there's too much sugar, or whatever, they're drinking cocktails, literally. They can become addicted. They're very similar to humans, and they kind of get pushed through this pipeline of the animal rescue and rehabilitation. Then they're released in the same area, and they're going to go back. So it's very, very difficult to work with this in practice. Keep track. Also, they're literally often in the jungle, so it's not as easy as just doing like a drive-by check-in for conservation researchers. Now, zoos in Costa Rica are the only place where you could have legal like wildlife tourism. And so animals there cannot be released to the wild. Maybe they were pets, or they were born in captivity, or they're like severely disabled and they can't be released. So the zoos are public facing, and then the rescue center is private facing. And there shouldn't be tourism there, but I found that there was lots of volunteerism at these rescue centers. So I don't know if 3 weeks is what qualifies a tourist necessarily, but some folks are maybe taking care of an orphan primate, and then there's a turnover of volunteers at these places. So discussion around that. Basically, you have captive wildlife and free living wildlife coming through here. This kind of explains what I was saying. And then they're reintroduced either to the zoos where there's tourism, or to the wild where there's ecotourism. So basically, animals can't really escape tourists or humans in this context, even in the best of contexts like Costa Rica, where wildlife are so protected. So my approach to this was very, all these different adjectives on the side. Interdisciplinary, I looked at the different factors that impact animal welfare, factors that impact their conservation, and I assessed all of them using different methods at my 3 focal sites. So these were the methods I used. So they were socioecological, which meant I did interviews, surveys, and a lot of participant observation with tourists, with locals living around the rescue centers, and with key informants, which involved like the staff, the keepers, the owners, etc. And I did behavioral observations of monkeys in the sites, and generally was just hanging out in the sanctuary for weeks at a time at these different sites, asking and talking about monkeys all of the time. So kind of a more technical look at my methodologies. These were the factors I was evaluating at these sanctuaries, and then these are the methods I used. So like participant observation was obviously relevant to literally everything I was looking at, but tourism surveys only influenced this part of my research. So what I found was that electrocution is a huge, huge issue, and there's not a lot published on this at all. In Costa Rica, you can see this is the line. So this is based on 365 reports of monkeys at 4 different sanctuaries. And this is the number that were electrocuted, so 90 of the 365. And electrocution is like horrible. It's really hard. Like, I think only about 30% of animals that come into sanctuaries actually make it to be rehabilitated. They usually are gone within the first few days. And that's because, as one vet told me, a monkey isn't going to allow itself to be caught unless it's like on death's door, basically. Same with the jaguar, same with these big mammals. So how to deal with this is sanctuaries are installing these wildlife bridges to sort of connect fragmented habitat. And so these are the conservation welfare scores from my 3 focal sites. Basically, all 3 had positive impacts on wildlife in these factors, and just to varying amounts. So site 2 ended up being sort of having the highest animal welfare and conservation impact. And that was largely due to the fact that the enclosures were really huge and like filled with foliage, and the animals could hide, whereas at the other 2, they seemed to be more stressed. And if you looked at the 3 sites on just at the welfare, they also varied in their ability to provide good mental experiences, their environmental surroundings in the enclosure, and the tourism events. Like at this site, there were 4 tours a day. So every 2 hours, a tour group was passing by the monkey enclosure. Whereas at the other site, there was like 5 tours a week. So that had significant impacts on the animal behavior, and that influenced how I ranked them. some more videos. So this is a territorial display. So this is at one of my sites. There's a tour group over there, and she's banging this sign and running around and like making these displays, and they're just popping. They're like, oh, she's so funny. And I'm thinking, let's move the sign or something, or figure out, maybe put up a barrier. Like, she's obviously upset. She even starts grabbing pebbles, and she knows which pebbles to grab because they're small enough to like throw through the fence, and she'll run like this and throw them. So she's really adapting ways to be territorial in captivity. So this is the same enclosure. There's 3 female capuchins that every single day, Dennis the Menace, which is the name that they gave him, the sanctuary, is a wild male, and he comes every single day. So this like species, this troop is partially captive, partially wild. It's really interesting, the sorts of communities that are built in these sanctuaries. And so here they're grooming, and she, that's the alpha female grooming the male, so she kind of like bit the other one, was like, get out of here, I want him, because he's highly valued as an interaction. So this is what it means to look at the lives of monkeys here. And I looked at this as care work. These animals are literally contributing to the life of a wild monkey and its life history. So why not look at animals in the sense of monkeys as doing emotional labor, ecological labor, educational and entertainment labor when they're facing tourists. So ultimately, sanctuaries are multi-species landscapes which shape welfare and conservation outcomes. So that's my GoPro, and I was filming and watching the capuchins, and then this troop of squirrel monkeys, which got released by the sanctuary, come back every single day to eat the food while the food's being given. So they like know the time the keepers are handing out food, and they go in. And these were released monkeys. So you can see that captivity is permeable. It's not easy to create these sorts of boundaries. So how can we live with how it is? So ultimately, making tourism better for animals involves meeting their freedoms. These are the animal welfare standards. So freedom from hunger, thirst, discomfort, pain, and fear, to express normal and natural behaviors. And more recently, there's been research on animals as having informed consent, like a right to exit an interaction, which could be like being able to hide in a shelter and be away from tourists. And so in this sense, we're strengthening their agency and self-determination, looking to make them serious stakeholders in the industry and provide them justice and legal protection. To learn more about ethical wildlife tourism, you can visit these accrediting sites or go to World Animal Protection, and generally keep a distance, look, don't touch. And this is an orphan monkey that this was like the best day of my life. I got to bring him to a veterinarian because there was no one else to do it. Oh, it just went away. But anyway, it was incredible. Yeah, so that's it.
Okay, I think we should do some questions.